Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed your Labor Day weekend, and hopefully you guys are ready for another week of biology. This week we will be continuing our discussion on animals and ecology. This week we will dive into what exactly an ecosystem actually means, and we will be covering chapter 31. And to open up for that chapter, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the different organization or the classification of organisms and the various domains that we can find. So the grouping of animals was originally done by shared characteristics. Like all organisms within domain Eukarya have cells that have a nucleus. However, as more is learned about the evolutionary relationships, animals instead are being grouped together based on presumed evolutionary lineages. Therefore, the classification for every species is constantly changing. And so taxonomy is the discipline of naming and classifying organisms according to certain rules. And like I was saying, those certain rules are changing right now. Scientists are focusing mainly on those evolutionary lineages. And systematics, within systematics, they classify organisms according. Systematics is just a classifying organisms based on those lineages. And you guys can remember the classification of organisms by a simple mnemonics. Dear King Philip came over for good soup. And that is domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And if you guys, as you guys can tell by the slide, these groups go from inclusive to exclusive. And that just means that there are going to be more animals and plants within the domain grouping, and as you go down the list, there are going to be less plants and animals within each group because they're going to start to split according to those shared groupings of characteristics or those evolutionary lineages. So you're going to have all plants and animals within just the domain group itself. But as you go to species, you're only going to have one species in that species grouping. And you guys will see that as we continue the lecture. So we have three different domains. We're going to have the domain Archaea, which includes all your prokaryotic organisms. And prokaryotic just means that they will not contain any membrane-bound nucleuses. I'm sure you guys have heard this term before. You probably remember it from high school biology. And prokaryotic organisms are also going to be single-celled. The domain bacteria are also going to be prokaryotic, and so they're going to be exactly like Archaea, and bacteria can be found anywhere, and I'm sure, again, bacteria sounds very familiar. These are going to be the organisms that primarily cause diseases that you guys are familiar with. But there's also good bacteria. Probiotics has been a more popular term in the media and news articles today. That's because it's important to have good bacteria in your stomach to maintain, well, a healthy ecosystem inside your body so that those bad bacteria don't take over. And then domain Eukarya contains all your both single-celled and multi-celled organisms inside the domain Eukarya. In the domain Archaea, you're going to find a lot of really unique organisms, like this example here of a single-celled organism called M. mazii. This particular prokaryote is able to produce methane, the type of gas that you would use to fill up your car. In the domain bacteria, you're going to find a lot of more familiar organisms. Bacteria live in the water, soil, atmosphere, and on or in organisms. Bacteria are going to be microscopic and are going to be very metabolically diverse, which just means that they could potentially make their own food, or they can consume food for energy. And this particular bacteria here might sound familiar, E. coli. E. coli is probably E. coli has a bad reputation for causing diseases, but it's actually a common bacteria found in our intestines and actually has some medical benefit. The domain eukarya is split up into 4 different kingdoms. There's kingdom Protistae, which are going to contain a lot of single-celled organisms. There's kingdom fungi, which is going to contain a lot of fungus. Mushrooms would be a popular example. Kingdom Plantae, which is going to contain all your plants. And then kingdom Animalia, which is going to contain all your animals. Each kingdom generally has a certain way of getting their energy. Fungi decompose organisms for food. Plantae will make their own food, and Animalia needs to consume their food. And Protista is able to use all 3 types of metabolic systems. Protists are multifaceted. They can be unicellular or multicellular, which, I'm sorry, correcting myself from the previous time, they can be both unicellular and multicellular. They can be producers, meaning they can make their own food. They can consume food for energy, or they can also decompose food for energy. One good example of a protista is the single-celled organism Euglena, and these guys can both consume their own food or make their own food. And your book will tell you, your book would say that they have both animal and plant-like characteristics. And what they mean by that is that they're able to consume their own food. So that's animal-like, and plant-like would be making their own food. In the kingdom fungi, you're going to find all your mushrooms. And all mushrooms are going to be decomposers. And that just means that they're going to break down all of the dead plants and animals found outside, which is both going to give them the energy that they need in order to reproduce and grow, but also will help return the nutrients found within those dead plants and animals back to the soil so that the plants can use them again. And any mushroom that you guys can think about will be in this kingdom. Within the kingdom Plantae, you're going to, find all your plants. And all plants are going to be producers. And this just means that they're going to use the energy from the sun and carbon dioxide to make glucose, which will give them the energy that they need to reproduce and to mature. And there's a lot of really interesting plants, like this bristlecone pine here. It is one of the oldest living organisms on the planet. Then kingdom Animalia, which is probably going to be the most familiar to us. It will include us, monkeys, dogs, cats, any type of animal that you can think of. And all of the organisms within this kingdom are going to be consumers, which of course just means that they, in order to get their energy, they're going to need to consume all their food. So each plant, animal, and bacteria species that you can think of is going to have a scientific name. And each scientific name is a binomial name, which means it will contain 2 parts. It's going to contain a genus and a species name. Our scientific name is Homo sapien. And so the first part is Homo, and that's going to be our genus name. There's no living species today that is within the genus Homo. Generally, ancestral humans are a part of this genus. And the second word, the species name, is going to be a specific epithet for that species. So sapien in Latin means wise, so we are considered to be wise animals. Scientists will universally use a scientific name so that there will be no confusion when a scientist that uses one language is talking to another scientist that uses another language about a particular species. All scientists will use the scientific names to clear up, to make sure that each scientist knows what animal they are talking about. Especially, this is really important within research, in case a scientist in China may want to redo a scientific experiment that a scientist in America did. So now that we had a brief introduction into the classification of animals, we are now going to enter into Chapter 31. Last week, we learned the biological organization of an ecosystem. You have your individual organisms that's a part of a species. You have your population, which is going to be all of the individuals of an animal or plant species within that particular location. You're going to have your community, which is going to be all of your animal and plant populations interacting together. And then you're going to have your ecosystem, which is the interactions of all the animal and plant species with their physical environment. A community is all of the animal and plant species in a given area interacting with one another. A community comes in all shapes and sizes and can be as small as the fungus, plants, worms, and insects found on a fallen log to all the plants and animals found in the rainforest along the Amazon River in Brazil. An example of relationship found within community is that between pollinators and flowers. Flowers are especially designed to attract a certain kind of pollinator, as we'll see here in the next couple of slides. Hummingbird pollinated flowers are usually red, and that's because this is a color that the hummingbirds can see. And then the petals are bent to allow the stamens, which contain the pollen, to rub along the hummingbird head. That way the hummingbird can take the pollen from flower to flower to pollinate those other flowers. Bats are nocturnal, and the flowers they pollinate are white or light colored, making them visible in the moonlight. The flowers smell like bats and are large and sturdy, enabling them to withstand insertion of the bat's head as it uses its long, bristly tongue to lap up the nectar and the pollen. The relationship between orchid flowers and wasps is a little different. The male wasp comes to the orchids looking for a mate, actually. The orchid flowers look and smell like the female wasps, so the male tries to mate with it. As it does this, the pollen gets onto the wasp and is carried to other flowers where the pollen can then fertilize the other orchids. The hummingbird, bat, and wasp are all suited to their environments because of the relationships they have with those flowers. All of the relationships in a community and the physical environment is defined as the ecosystem. Changes to the balance of these relationships can occur if plants and animal species disappear or if non-native animals and plants are introduced. The more dramatic the change, the more dramatic the consequences are going to be, up and including extinction. Extinction can occur if the change in the environment is too rapid. The species richness of a community is all of the plants and animals found in that community. To tell whether a community has a lot of species, it helps to compare the species richness of one community over another. A tropical rainforest contains a wide variety of plants and animals, while a coniferous forests are primarily made of evergreen trees. From this, we can tell that the tropical rainforest has a higher species richness. To really understand the health of a community, it helps to understand the diversity of that community. The diversity of a community goes beyond the species richness to include species distribution and the amount of organisms found in each population. Species distribution are the various locations where the plant and animal species are found in that area. For example, if we have two different forests, and each forest has 77 trees. The first forest has 76 Douglas fir and 1 white pine, while the second forest has 36 Douglas fir and 41 white pine. Both forests have the same species richness as at 2 species of trees. However, the second coniferous forest is more diverse and healthier because it has a higher amount of white pine. And so this white pine population is going to be more stable than the white pine population found in our first forest. The species richness and diversity of a community will change over time. This change can either be slow or quick. Natural disasters and human disturbances, like a dam in a river, could quickly change the species' richness and diversity pretty quickly. Lake Erie has changed a lot over the past century due to the introduction of various invasive species, like zebra mussels and round gobies. After the disturbances cause the harmful changes in the environment will the environment will start to balance out and start to heal itself. It does this by slowly bringing back first bacteria, fungal plants, plant species, and then animal species. Ecologists have found out that there is a certain pattern to the reintroduction of the plants and animals and have been able to make models in ecological succession. Ecological succession is the orderly process of the increase in species diversity in a certain area. The model of ecological succession that ecologists have come up with is called the climax pattern model. In this model, a climax community is an environment that is in balance with each other. All of the plant and animal populations have a similar number of individuals, and the populations are all kept in check. They base this model on a couple of different principles. One of the principles is that the climate of a community determines the plant and animal species found there. And by the climate, I just mean like weather patterns. The second principle is that each climax community has species of bacteria, fungi, plants, and animals. And then the third principle is within the respective environment, species generally arrive into an area at different times. The temperature and humidity of an area will determine the plant and animal species found there. Temperate forests occur where there is an adequate amount of rainfall and moderate temperatures. And you can find temperate forests around Fort Wayne. And then deserts, found more out west. Deserts is going to occur where there's limited rainfall and high temperatures. There are two models of ecological succession, primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession occurs on land where there is no soil, like hardened lava rocks and bedrock scraped by glaciers. And then secondary succession begins on land that already has soil, like an old farmer's field. So both primary and secondary succession has a similar progression of types of organisms. With environments that have no soil, lichen and moss will be the first to appear so that they can break down the lava and rock into soil. When the soil is formed, other plants arrive, generally from smaller to larger plants. Grass to shrubs to small trees, all the way up to larger trees. With the secondary succession, lichen and moss will already be present, so we'll already have our nutrient-rich soil. But grass can quickly appear since we have that nutrient-rich soil. And then shrubs will eventually appear, small trees, and then again up to large trees. The first species to arrive to any environment is called opportunistic pioneer species. Pioneer species tend to be lichens and mosses. The fungus and lichen will break down the rocks and lava into usable mineral nutrition. The lichen helps produce soil needed by other plants. Pioneer species all share similar lifestyle characteristics. They're going to be small in stature, short-lived, quick to mature, and produce numerous offspring per reproductive event. Once the pioneer species has established themselves in an environment, then the equilibrium species can move in. These species also share similar lifestyle characteristics. They're going to be larger in size, long-lived, slow to mature, and produce few offspring per reproductive event. And what I mean by per reproductive event is just mean a single time that they produce a litter. So secondary succession can happen pretty quickly. This is because we already have our nutrient-rich soil in our environment, so the plants can already start growing. So in this example here, we have the same field and we can see the progression of the plants and animals just over a 20-year period. So this is an old field, so some soil is already going to be present. However, there is still going to be a lot of exposed bedrock. Within that first year, the lichen and moss will build up the soil. By year 2, shrubs and grasses have moved in. By year 5, small trees have started to move in. And then by year 20, the larger plants have started to move in. So again, we can get a pretty good environment going in just a short time span. So the specific succession of plants and animals happen because of their specific relationships that they have with each other. Lichen come first because the fungus is able to turn the rocks into usable minerals for the algae and then any of the plants that will come after that. So again, just creating that nutrient-rich soil for algae and plants to grow in. The grass comes second because it is able to live off the soil and nutrients produced by that lichen and moss. And then the more plants and animals that appear, the more complicated the relationships get. And we have 5 different types of relationships that we can find within any community. We have competition, which is going to be the competition between 2 species or even within the same species for limited amount of food and habitat within any given area. And this will have a negative effect on the abundance of both species or both individual animals in a species. You're going to have predation, which of course is just a predator feeding on a prey. You're going to have parasitism, when a parasite will get its nutrients from a host. You're going to have commensalism, which is one species benefits while the other one is not harmed. Then you're going to have mutualism, which is when both species in a relationship will benefit from one another. All of these relationships affect the species involved. With competition, both species populations will decrease since they're competing with each other for food or habitat. With predation and parasitism, the predator or parasite population will increase, while the population of the prey or host will decrease. Commensalism is when one of the species population increases while the other species population is unaffected. So the population will not decrease or increase. And with mutualism, the populations of both species will increase since they both benefit from the relationship. The relationships a species finds itself in, as well as the habitat of that species, helps to determine the ecological niche of that species. Each animal occupies a certain area within a habitat, like otters in a kelp forest in oceans near the coast, and plays a certain role within that environment. Like the otters preying on fish in the ocean. Other roles a species may find itself in is as a photosynthesizer, so a plant making its own food, prey, or a parasite. The habitat and role of the otter makes up its ecological niche, and only the otter can fill that particular niche, because the niche is especially suited to the otter. No other species could take its spot because the other species would have different eating, living, and reproduction habits. In order to fulfill its ecological niche, the particular species relies on its environment to be in pristine condition. So for example, the back swimmer, which is an insect found within ponds or lakes, preys on various insects in that pond, and it requires the lake or pond to be in a really good condition in order for it to fulfill its particular role in the environment. The lake or pond needs to have plenty of vegetation and clear, warm water in order for the back swimmer to survive properly. It uses the vegetation to hide from its predators, the clear water to find prey, and then the warm temperature to maintain a good metabolic rate, so it can digest its food. Since it's cold-blooded, it wouldn't be able to digest its food if it was in, or at least it would digest its food slower if it was in a colder body of water. Since it is sometimes difficult to know the full behavior and needs of a species, Ecologists sometimes focus on a particular aspect of the niche of the species, like the diet. Flamingos feed on small mollusks, crustaceans, and vegetable matter strained from the mud pumped through their bills by their powerful tongues. Dabbling ducks feed by tipping their tail up to reach the aquatic plants, seeds, snails, and insects. Aphisids feed on insects, small marine invertebrates, and seeds by sweeping their bills from side to side in the shallow water. And oyster catchers pry open bivalve shells with their knife-like bills and probe sand for worms and crabs. Plover ducks, plovers dart around beaches and grasslands, hunting for insects and small invertebrates. Competition for food, habitat, and mates within a community helps structure the diversity and richness of the species found within that community. This was seen within an experiment performed in the 1930s with two species of Paramecium. Paramecium caudatum was grown in one test tube, and Paramecium aurelia was grown in another test tube. Both populations flourished within their own test tube. However, when these two species were put in the same test tube, Paramecium aurelia acquired more food and so experienced an increase in population. This eventually led to the dying out of the Paramecium caudatum. This experiment helped scientists to formulate the competitive exclusion principle, which states that no two species can occupy the same area at the same time. Thankfully, competition between two species doesn't always have to lead to the extinction of one of the populations. If the resources were successfully divided between the two species, then both of them would be able to survive in the same habitat at the same time. Food can be partitioned by several different methods, including feeding behavior, the physical traits of the animals, or even their reproductive behaviors. Feeding behaviors of species can help partition the resources. For a lot of the native bird species in Indiana, they all eat seeds, insects, and fruit, but may eat at different times of the day or in different areas, therefore spreading around the resources. The sparrow and hummingbird are able to coexist because they have different beaks, allowing them to either eat seeds or to get nectar from flowers, partitioning the resources. Swallows, swifts, and martins, which are all a type of bird, eat flying insects and parachuting spiders. If they were all in the same area at the same time, then one or two of the species would probably die out. However, each bird has different nesting sites and migrate at different times of the year, so are not within the same area at the same time. This ensures that there's enough insects to go around between the different species. If resources are partitioned amongst similar species, something called character displacement could occur. Character displacement is when the physical characteristics of a species differ amongst the populations on where they live. This was seen amongst three species of Galapagos finches that were found on various islands. When the three ground finches lived on the different islands, the beaks of all three finches were the same size. However, when all three species lived together, they had different size beaks. This is so the birds don't have to compete for the seeds that they eat, since a bird's beak determines the size of the seeds that they can eat. So here are the three different Galapagos species where their beaks changed sizes when they were all living in the same area. We have G. fulginosa, G. fortis, and then G. magnorostis. While G. fortis was on Daphne Island and G. fulgurosa was on Crossman Island, they each had about medium-sized beaks. However, when on the Galapagos Island with a third ground finch, that's the G. magnorostris, the beaks found on G. fulguinosa had decreased, and the beaks found on the G. fortis had increased. Because they show character displacement while all living in the same niche, it was evidence that these ground-dwelling finches were able to successfully divide up the food so that they could all successfully live in the same area at the same time. Mutualism is also important in shaping the diversity of the species found within an ecosystem. Mutualism is when both species in the relationship benefit, like with lichen. Lichen is found in many different habitats and is made of two different organisms, a fungi and an algae. The fungus will break down rock and provide minerals to the algae, while the algae is able to photosynthesize, so it provides the fungus with glucose. This example of mutualism is a good example of the interdependence of animals, plants, and weather patterns. In the western United States, the white-barked pine, Clark's nutcracker, which is a type of bird, and grizzly bears are reliant on each other. The white-barked pine has cones that are turned upward, so the seeds don't fall to the floor. Instead, the Clark's nutcracker gathers and eats the seeds. Any seeds it doesn't eat, any seeds that they don't eat, they will bury them in the ground. And then grizzly bears will come along and eat the seeds that were buried. The seeds then will further be spread by the bear's feces. The white-barked pine is reliant on fire to germinate their seeds. If a fire doesn't come through the area, then none of the seeds will germinate and new trees will not grow. This will decrease the white-bark population, and in turn decrease the nutcracker and grizzly bear population. As all species within a mutualistic relationship experience a population increase together, all of them will also experience a decrease in population together. The top picture is of a Clark nutcracker. It's a white bird with some black feathers on their wings. The grizzly bear is pictured on the bottom, which is grizzly bears are going to be larger than black bears found around the southern Midwest. Within a lot of communities, the aforementioned relationships keep animals and plant populations in check. Some communities are stabilized through one species, and this one species will be called a keystone species. The keystone species holds the web of relationships within a community together. This one species may or may not be the most abundant or the most dangerous in that community. However, the loss of the keystone species could mean extinction for all the other ones. For example, bats are a keystone species found within the tropical rainforest. The bats are very important in pollination and in seed dispersal of many of the plants. If the bats were to be killed off, then the number of trees would greatly decrease, which would also greatly decrease the animals that ate off those plants. Grizzly bears are a keystone species found in the northwestern United States. They also help disperse the seeds of the plants, but also helps keep the herbivore population down, further assisting the plants in the Northwest. The stability of a community can also be greatly interrupted by the addition of non-native animals or plants into the environment. A native species already has their particular ecological niche within their environment, so they already have their particular habitat that they live in and the particular plants or animals that they may eat. Exotic species do not have an ecological niche within the environment that they are not from. If the exotic species were to move in, it would compete with the native animals for food and habitat. Because the exotic animals has no natural predator in the area, the exotic animal then could greatly increase. The more exotic animals means less food and habitat for the native animals, which will obviously have a devastating effect on the native species population. When an exotic animal population greatly increases, They then become an invasive species. Some examples of invasive species include the Asian carp and the emerald ash borer. Because there is an abundant food source and no predation on either of these animals, their populations have increased exponentially. This limits the amount of food and space available to native animals, which decreases the native animal populations. Carrying capacity will be different for each species in different environments. The carrying capacity will be lower for the Asian carp in their natural habitat because of the competition and predation it experiences from other animals. The carrying capacity will be higher for the Asian carp in the Great Lakes because there is an abundance of food, no predators, and hardly any competition. The community of plants and animals interacting with the surrounding physical environment makes up the ecosystem of that area. And feeding habits are one way that the animals can interact within its environment. And an autotroph is when an animal is able to make its own food through a process like photosynthesis. And a heterotroph is when an animal gets its food from other sources, like us eating food. Autotrophs make their own food by consuming inorganic nutrients like carbon dioxide from the air and minerals from the ground, and then using an energy source to produce organic nutrients like glucose, which is a type of sugar. Organisms that can perform photosynthesis are called photoautotrophs. Algae, which makes up phytoplankton, are the producers in the ocean, while green plants are the producers on land. Algae and green plants will then release oxygen in both the water, into the water and into the atmosphere for the animals to use in there. Some bacteria are chemotrophs. Chemoautotrophs are generally found in places with no sun, like caves or in hydrothermal vents found at the bottom of the ocean. Instead of using solar energy to make glucose, chemotrophs use the energy from the chemical bonds and compounds like ammonia and nitrates to make glucose. Heterotrophs will eat the glucose created by the algae and the plants to perform cellular respiration. As a result, they will release carbon dioxide into the air. Depending on their place in the food web, heterotrophs can either be primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers. The animals that reach the plants first, like herbivores, are the primary consumers. Animals that eat the primary consumers are called secondary consumers. And animals that eat the secondary consumers are the tertiary consumers, and generally are going to be the top predator in the environment. Primary consumers are herbivores, or even sometimes omnivores, which include species of insects, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. Zooplankton are the herbivores of the ocean. They feed on the phytoplankton. Secondary and tertiary consumers will consume meat, so will either be omnivores or carnivores. Primary consumers can be really small, like a caterpillar, or really large, like a giraffe. Secondary consumers, like the praying mantis, will eat the herbivore that ate the leaf. Tertiary consumers, like the common lora, which is a bird, will eat the first carnivore that ate the herbivore. Another heterotroph are decomposers, which include bacteria and fungi. Decomposers complete the circle between the heterotrophs and the autotrophs, since they break down the dead organisms and makes those nutrients available to the plants once more to use for photosynthesis and things it would need. As the bacteria and fungi break down the waste or bodies of dead plants and animals, also called detritus, they are acquiring the nutrients they need to live. Decomposers provide a very valuable service. Without decomposers, plants would have to wait for rocks to break down the nutrients they need, which would take a really long time. As a result, there wouldn't be as many plants as there are today, and so not as many animals as there are today. The plants, herbivores, carnivores, and decomposers we just talked about keep a constant flow of energy and chemicals going within the food web. Energy flow in a food web starts when the plants use solar energy to create glucose. Chemical flow starts when the plants intake compounds like carbon dioxide and nitrogen to create things that the plant would need. The energy flow will continue as glucose is passed from plant to herbivore or omnivore to the carnivore, and then back to the decomposer. As glucose is being transferred, energy will be lost in urine, feces, or just from some of the daily use of the animal. This lost energy cannot be passed on to the omnivore or the carnivore that will eat the herbivore. Because energy is lost during the food web, the constant energy source of the sun is needed to produce more food for all the plants and animals. Only a portion of the nutrients made by the plants during photosynthesis will be passed on to the herbivores. Plants can undergo cellular respiration in addition to photosynthesis. During cellular respiration, glucose is converted into ATP that is used for the plant's own purposes. So therefore, a large amount of the glucose made by the plant will be used up by the plant. Herbivores can also only pass on a little bit of the energy that it eats to the carnivores that prey on them. This is because the herbivores will need to use those calories to grow or develop into adults, to heal themselves, or to look for food and to reproduce. Some of the energy they eat is never digested and instead is eliminated in their urine or feces. Energy can only be passed on to carnivores in the form of extra body weight or in any offspring that the particular animal produces. Of all the energy found within herbivores, only about 10% of the energy consumed by herbivores can be passed on to the carnivores. When energy is used for cellular respiration, it is lost as heat and is no longer available to any animals. The rest of the energy is passed on to decomposers as feces, urine, and the bodies of the animals. The energy flowing through an ecosystem makes up a food web. There are two different types of food webs. The grazing food web is the traditional food web that you've heard about, which begins with plants, then herbivores that eat the plants, then the omnivores and carnivores. The detrital food web instead begins with decomposers like bacteria and fungi. Bacteria and fungi are food sources for worms and other insects, which are consumed by animals like salamanders and shrews. These two food webs can be connected if any organism from one is eaten by the organism from another, like shrews being eaten by a larger carnivore in the grazing food web. The grazing food web is represented by the green arrows, and the detritus food web is represented by the yellow arrows. You can clearly see that the two food webs are constantly intermingling with one another. Fungi can be food for chipmunks, which also eats the acorns on trees. The carnivorous insects, like the praying mantis, is food for mice, chipmunks, and birds. All of the predator-prey relationships in an ecosystem are going to be just as complicated. Notice all that the roles of the animals can switch also, depending on the animal species involved. For example, the salamander is going to be the predator to the praying mantis, but a prey to the fox. The shrew and salamanders are considered the top predators in the detritus food webs, but are going to be a lot lower in the grazing food web. Both food webs are going to be brought to full circle when the feces and dead bodies of the plant's primary consumers and secondary consumers are decomposed by the bacteria and fungi. To study the predator-prey relationships of animals, ecologists break down the food web into food chains, which are the dietary relationships between a single line of species. There are going to be many food chains within a food web. Each animal involved in the food chain represents a trophic level. And the first trophic level are going to be the producers. The second trophic level are the herbivores and omnivores. And the third and sometimes fourth trophic level will include omnivores and carnivores. And food chains are short because energy is lost between the trophic levels. In general, about 10% of the energy in one trophic level will be passed on to the next trophic level. And this is the reason why we need a lot of plants on Earth, because all of the plants needed to support a small number of carnivores, because a lot of plants are needed to support all the carnivores within a particular ecosystem. An ecological pyramid helps depict the energy losses between the trophic levels. So an ecological pyramid shows the amount of plants, herbivores, carnivores, and top carnivores in a food chain. The biomass within a trophic level is going to be how many individuals there are multiplied by each individual body weight. And there is always going to be more biomass within the producer or plant trophic level than any of the other ones. And in this particular ecological pyramid, there is 1,000 kilograms of plants. And because only 10% of the energy can be passed on to each trophic level, this can only support 100 kilograms of herbivores. The 100 kilograms of herbivores can only support 10 kilograms of carnivores, which can then only support 1 kilogram of predators, of top predators. So from 1,000 kilograms of plants that we started out with, only about 0.1% of the energy will reach the top of this particular food chain. This is why we need so many plants in a habitat, and also why we need a continual source of solar energy to support a full ecosystem. Without the sun, ecosystems would quickly lose energy and collapse. So we just went over energy cycles within an ecosystem. So now we'll look over the chemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles are pathways which chemicals cycle through an ecosystem. And there are two types. There is sedimentary and gaseous. The sedimentary cycles include chemicals like nitrogen that is taken from the soil, flow through the food chain, and then return back to the soil. The gaseous cycles include chemicals like carbon dioxide, which are taken from the atmosphere, flow through the food chain, and then returns to the atmosphere. These cycles involve living components like producers, decomposers, and consumers, and then non-living components like the chemicals, soil, and atmosphere. Chemical cycling of any element may involve reservoirs and exchange pools. A reservoir is normally unavailable to organisms. Exchange pools are where organisms can get the chemicals in the reservoirs. Exchange pools are very important in any community of plants and animals. Reservoirs store large amounts of chemicals in the form of fossil fuels, minerals in the rock, and then sediment in the ocean. In order to get these needed chemicals to plants and animals, they need to be made available in the exchange pool, which includes the atmosphere, soil, and water. Phosphorus is a really important chemical within any environment. Producers use phosphates in a variety of ways, like making them into phospholipids in cell membranes, ATP, and nucleotides like RNA and DNA. When consumers eat plants, they use the phosphates to make teeth, bones, and shells. Phosphates can be made available to plants by slow weathering of rocks or by the decomposition of dead plants and animals. Generally, the amount of phosphates within an environment will always be in use by something, and as a result, phosphates will be a determining factor in the amount of species within an environment. So there's this strange phenomenon that happens about every 4 years that really demonstrates the importance of phosphates and calcium in an ecosystem. So there is a group of animals called lemmings that will seemingly wander over a cliff into the ocean. And for a long time, scientists didn't know why. But after doing some observation and research, they discovered it's because they were looking for phosphates. Every 4 years or so, grasses and sedges of the tundra become rich in minerals, and the lemming population flourish. Grasses and sedges then decline due to the overabundance of lemmings, and since the lemmings are eating on those grasses so much. Since there is a limited number of food, then the lemmings go diving off the cliff looking for phosphates. All of this dramatically reduces the lemming population, which then gives a break to the grasses and sedges, allowing those plants to greatly increase in population again. This takes about 4 years before the animals decompose and return minerals to the producers, which allows the cycle to start all over again. Like phosphorus, nitrogen is also a limiting chemical within an ecosystem. Plants cannot absorb nitrogen through the atmosphere. Instead, they have to rely on bacteria to make nitrogen available to them. Plants can take in nitrogen through other molecules, like ammonium and nitrate from the soil. However, the bacteria has to break these molecules down for the plants to gain nitrogen from the molecule. There are two processes that bacteria use to fix nitrogen. Nitrogen fixation converts nitrogen gas into ammonium. With nitrification, bacteria will first turn the ammonium into nitrate, and then the nitrite into nitrates. Nitrogen is used to make proteins in plants and animals. The amount of available nitrogen within plants and animals isn't dependent on the amount of nitrogen gas within the atmosphere, but the amount of ammonium available in the soil. The amount of nitrogen in the soil greatly increases with the use of fertilizers on farms. The chemical cycle we'll cover most this semester is going to be the carbon cycle. We'll be covering photosynthesis and cellular respiration later on in the semester. The carbon cycle on land is pretty direct since it just includes cellular respiration and photosynthesis. The carbon cycle will start with plants when they take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then turn it into glucose through photosynthesis. And then animals will continue the cycle when they eat those plants and then use cellular respiration to turn the glucose back into carbon dioxide. The carbon cycle within water is going to be more indirect. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere is the same amount of carbon that is within the ocean. As one increases, then the other one increases. When carbon dioxide enters into the ocean, it becomes bicarbonate ions. Algae then uses the carbon in the bicarbonate ions to undergo photosynthesis. When ocean animals breathe out carbon dioxide, it is also converted into bicarbonate ions. If there is more carbon in the ocean than in the atmosphere, the bicarbonate ions will turn into carbon dioxide gas and be released into the atmosphere. This is one reason why the release of a lot of fossil fuels into the atmosphere can be really bad. Fossil fuels contain a lot of carbon, and that carbon is released into the atmosphere when it is burned. The excess carbon dioxide is then absorbed into the ocean, which increases the acidity of the ocean. And an acidic, watery environment can be very dangerous for the animals living in it. The carbon in dead animals could either be returned to the soil or atmosphere or turned into fossil fuels, becoming a reservoir. Most of the fossil fuels were created during the Carboniferous period, which was about 286 to 360 million years ago. As humans have been using these fossil fuels, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has increased. Normally, cellular respiration and photosynthesis rates are about equal, which creates a healthy amount of carbon within the atmosphere to create the greenhouse effect. The carbon in the atmosphere acts like a blanket for the Earth, since it traps the sun's heat in the atmosphere, allowing there to be a warm place for animals and plants to live. But with too much carbon in the atmosphere, the blanket is too thick. The rise in carbon causes a rise in global temperatures, shifting climate patterns, and devastating events. Some examples include the large amount of fires in California or all the hurricanes that have recently happened, like the Hurricane Michael in Florida, Hurricane Florence in North Carolina and South Carolina, and then Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico that happened a few years back. The final level of biologic organization we'll talk about is the biosphere, which is all the different ways the ecosystem of the world interact with each other. Aquatic ecosystems are determined by nutrient level, oxygen level, and whether it is fresh or salt water. Aquatic ecosystems include lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and the ocean. The ocean covers 70% of the Earth's surface. Water ecosystems are further divided into coral reefs and estuaries, which are areas where freshwater rivers are flowing into the ocean. The mixture of fresh and salt water is called brackish water. Terrestrial ecosystems are determined by the temperature and rainfall within that area. Terrestrial biomes include the tundra, taiga, temperate grasslands, temperate forest, deserts, savannas, and tropical rainforest. Tundra is the northernmost biome and consists of year-round permafrost. This prevents large plants from becoming established. Taiga is a very cold northern coniferous forest. Temperate grasslands primarily have grasses and large shrubs and trees. They receive less rainfall than temperate forests. The forests found around Indiana are known as temperate forests, since the seasons vary and the trees lose their leaves once a year. You have deserts, which will contain a lot of cacti and don't receive much rainfall. Savannas are tropical grasslands with alternating wet and dry seasons. Tropical rainforests occur at the equator, have a high average temperature, and the greatest amount of rainfall of all the biomes. It is going to generally be dominated by large, evergreen, broad-leafed trees. Biomes are generally found in a horizontal pattern across the globe. The general trends are the closer you get to the equator, the more hot biomes you'll have, and then the further away you get from the equator, the colder the biomes will be. The closer you are to a body of water means that there will be more rainfall, and then the further away from a body of water means that biome will have less rainfall. So for example, you'll have the tundra and the taiga located at high altitudes where it is cold and doesn't receive a lot of rainfall. So you'll have few plants that are able to withstand cold weather and less rainfall, like pine trees or fir trees. Temperate grasslands and forests can be found at a lower altitude, So it can support more plants to the higher temperatures and rainfall. The hottest environments will be found around the equator, and then depending on the amount of rainfall there will then determine the amount of plants found there. The tropical rainforest will have more plants than the dry desert, since the rainforest will receive more rain than a desert would. Alright guys, that's all I have for you today. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.